Hey guys, I'm Jeremy. Today I'll tell you an insane story many people haven't heard of. This was one of the biggest mass murders up until that time, and the first time a major commercial airline was blown up over here in north of Denver. And so I'm right here actually at the Stapleton Airport Control Tower. This has since become a restaurant. This was abandoned in the 90s, and they made a new airport another 20 miles east of here. But it was here on November 1st, 1955, that Jack Gilbert Graham dropped off his mom, who was on a flight to Alaska, and he had put 25 sticks in dynamite in his mother's suitcase, which later blew up on the plane. And the reasons for this? Well, one of the big things was that he wanted to collect on the insurance money. And the other reason was because he grew up in an orphanage for several years. So anyway, in this video, I'll give you kind of a rundown of the background of the perpetrator and his upbringing. And then I'll show some areas around here. This airport's obviously gone now. It's just parks. And then I'll show you where he worked. And it was the restaurant that he blew up. His mom gave him a restaurant and he friggin' blew it up. And then I'll go by the orphanage that he grew up in, the cemetery where his mom's at. And if I have time, I could go to the actual, like where they found all the debris. It was over a 5-mile area, and there's no memorial or anything like that, so I probably won't go up there because it's about a 40-minute drive just east of Longmont. So he obviously killed his mother and the 44 people on board. And so this was one of the hugest FBI investigations at the time, and a huge tragedy that most people have never heard of. So pretty crazy story. This was the original airport of Denver, but they moved it out of the city more because this is only like 15 minutes from downtown. So they needed an airport further outside the city. Back in the day, you'd actually drive under the overpass, and the runway went right over the highway. So a lot of people had complained about noise and everything, so they ended up moving it outside the city another like 20 miles to where the new airport's at. So his mother, Daisy King, came from a decent family. Her dad was a teacher, then a lawyer, and then a district judge for Colorado. So she was definitely middle to upper class. And she got married and had a daughter, and then got divorced, and later married William Graham, who was Jack Graham's father. And so he was born on January 23rd, 1932. And this was during the Great Depression, so definitely not easy times. 5 years later, his dad dies of pneumonia. So now you have a mother with 2 kids, obviously not a good financial situation at that time. Even today, obviously, that would be hard. So his mother sent him to the Clayton School for Boys. And this was basically an orphanage where you also got education and learned some things about agriculture and farming and things like that. So from what I understand, it didn't seem like that bad of a place. I'll go there later in the video because everyone, you know, you hear orphanage and right away you're like, oh my God, it's the most horrible place in the world. But it's just like the video I did on Columbine. Dylan's home was amazing. And it seems like this orphanage wasn't quite as bad as people might think. Now that doesn't mean that there weren't any problems in there. Who knows if there was abuse or other negative things, but it was definitely well funded. And so anyway, I'll go back to that later. And so around the time he was 15, he ended up joining the Coast Guard. He forged papers to go in when he was like 15 or 16. He lasted about 6 months or so, and they had found out that he was underage, and he ended up getting kicked out. Now, he did get an honorable discharge, which is actually kind of unique considering he did have 2 months where he was absent without leave. So he should have actually gotten like an other than honorable discharge. But probably because he was underage, you know, they just let him out when he was like around 16. So he later gets a job as a payroll clerk, which if they would have known better, that would probably be the last person you would want to have that job, because this kid was just a criminal. And so he took like 42 blank checks and he signed them each for $100 and forged his boss names, went all around Denver cashing those checks. And so, yeah, he had $4,200. He bought a convertible and had gone down to Texas, obviously left town. He was like Colorado's most wanted. And he had some issue down there. He was like selling whiskey and stuff, which I don't even really know why. He's like bootlegging whiskey in Texas. It wasn't the prohibition at that time. This is like, you know, like 1949 or 50. But Anyway, he got in trouble down there, and there was a roadblock. He drove through it going over 100 miles per hour, and the cops even fired at him. They didn't kill him, which is a shame, obviously, as we know how the story goes. And he did 60 days of jail in Lubbock, Texas. While he was in jail, of course, people in Colorado, they found out that he had charges up here, so they sent him back up here to face those charges as well for forgery for those checks. So by this time, his mom had already gotten remarried to another guy. His last name was King. That's why she has the name Daisy King. And they were married for only a couple of years, but he had a lot of money. And so while Jack was in the orphanage at that time, she ended up opening up. After he died, she got a bunch of money, like $100,000, which obviously in today's terms, like $1 million. And so she helped him out. She paid back like $2,500, and then he had to pay the rest of the $1,700 on his own, which you could imagine that in today's term was probably like, you know, him stealing $4,200 was probably like stealing like 50 grand today. So definitely no small amount of money. He had a few years probation, and he met his officers and everything, so no problems there. And he was, I guess, slowly making those payments back. He initially was working as like a heavy-duty mechanic for a bit, and then his mom had opened up that fast food place, so he started to run that. So I'll show you right now where this restaurant is. It's down on Federal Boulevard, just southwest of Denver, a pretty popular commercial road. So 70 years ago, this was the Crown 8 drive-in that Jack's mom had bought and started back in the day in the 50s. And so he was running this place. Obviously, it was a burger place back then, so it's probably like takeaway burgers and stuff, and so now it's tacos. Not a big surprise there. And yeah, he was running this for a while. As soon as it opened, or when he took it over, there was some vandalism right at the beginning. And then in like September of 1955, there was a gas leak and it blew up. And then he was trying to claim the insurance money. I don't know if it was entirely blown up, but major damage. But he got that insurance claim, and then right around that time, he had a new pickup truck that he drove, parked it on the tracks, and got out real quick, and a train hit it. Of course, he lied and said that it stalled or something like that. So 2 huge insurance scams right before the plane scam. And yeah, just what a despicable kid. I mean, I know it's not easy to run a restaurant when you're, 22, but it's kind of cool. At least you don't have to be the guy just flipping burgers. You can make decent money, but he was fighting with his mom all the time about money and things. So he was, obviously taking money off the top all the time. And yeah, had a great thing that he could have had. This restaurant, his mom gave him a house, and, paid off $2,500 of his forged checks. And one of the other reasons why I blew up the plane, not just insurance and mad about the orphanage, it was because she wasn't going to be there for Thanksgiving later that month. I mean, Jesus, man, just what a child. You're like 22, 23 years old, and you care that much about Thanksgiving? I mean, he's got his own wife and 2 kids. It's like, give me a break, dude. Just so entitled. So I was actually going to get a burrito here, but it's Sunday, so they're closed. So after all this nonsense with, forging checks, trying to cash in on this insurance policy with his truck and his mom's restaurant, now he's got another idea. He's gonna blow up the plane that his mom's gonna go on. So how did he get some ideas for this? So just 3 weeks before he bombed this plane, there was actually another plane that took off from Denver and crashed in Wyoming. And so, everyone on the plane died, obviously, and it was pretty big news. So I think that was one thing, because his intention was to have the plane blow up in the mountains. And by November, you're already getting some snow. And so they wouldn't be able to do any recovery or locate much of the things until after winter, which is like April or May or even June if it's at a high altitude. So anyway, just to give you a basic history of some of the airline disasters at that time, this was the first major one in the United States. Besides, there was probably a smaller one in the 30s of a plane that took off from New Jersey and crashed in Indiana or something. About 8 people died. That might have been like mob or mafia related, but they never found the perpetrator, figured that one out. So just 6 years before he blew up the plane, in Montreal, there was actually a guy who used dynamite to blow up the plane and get insurance money. And so he fell in love with a young woman. I think she's still in high school, and he was married to another woman that was, middle age or whatever. And he knew if he get divorced that he'd lose everything. And so he conjured up this scheme to blow up the plane and get that money. And he actually had a couple friends help him out with the whole act. And it was kind of the same thing. He had hoped that the plane blew up into the river, because Montreal's like basically kind of like an island. It's surrounded by a bunch of rivers, and so if it's in the water, it's going to be really hard for them to identify the cause of the crash and stuff. But it blew up early overland, and they were able to determine that there was some explosives and things there in the plane. And so he actually ended up getting caught with the other two people, and all three of them ended up getting executed for that crime within 2 years or so. And actually the guy from Montreal got an idea for doing that incident from a woman and some people in the Philippines who earlier that year in, I think, 1949 had blown up a plane in the Philippines over some love triangle or something like that. So yeah, it's a shame that all these people get all these ideas from one another, but it's just kind of the way it goes. So actually this airport, Stapleton's, named after the mayor of Denver, who was a mayor from the late 20s up until 1946. And they're actually going to change the name of this area, I think, pretty soon, because he was a member of the KKK. So last year they had changed the name of Mt Evans, who was the governor during the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864-5. And they killed about 200 natives, mostly women and children. So they changed that mountain to Mount Blue Sky. And I think they're going to change Stapleton's name too. And so, he has this plot. He wants to kill his mom over... I didn't see so many documents talking about the orphanage. But yeah, they are fighting all the time. So now, as far as dynamite goes, because it seems kind of odd, like, could you just go to a supermarket and buy that, or a hardware store? And actually, back in the day, you could. Many farmers were able to, buy dynamite to blow up rocks or stumps on their property. And getting dynamite, I mean, even up until the late 60s or 70s, at that time, they changed it where you need to get a $5, permit. You need to fill out some paperwork. And it really wasn't until 9/11 that got highly regulated. Because, of course, 9/11 wasn't blown up with dynamite. The planes crashed into the towers. But they were like, well, if terrorists are going to blow up planes, they could obviously just go to the store easily and get dynamite, which is also super dangerous. So, yeah, back in that day, he was able to just go into a store, get a bunch of dynamite. He actually had worked briefly for an electrician to learn the insides of the basics of electrical things, and asked that guy for advice, what do I need to do to, get certain things. Not directly saying it was a bomb, of course, but he got the blasting caps and the wire and, a 7-volt battery or something, and a timer for an hour. And actually, it's kind of ironic, too, because... do you know who invented dynamite? It was actually Allred Nobel. You've heard of the Nobel Peace and Science Prizes that they have every year. It was a Swedish guy who invented dynamite. And so, yeah, it's kind of ironic that that's where, the Nobel Peace Prize comes from. And he probably, left all the funds and created that because he knew a lot of people were very critical of him inventing that, because that was just another way of killing people, right? Now, they didn't really use much dynamite in warfare. They usually use TNT and other things because dynamite's volatile and not good in bad weather conditions. But yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. And he had a little bit of experience using dynamite while he was in the Coast Guard, it was reported later. And he even used dynamite when he was a mechanic. He couldn't get one of the bolts off of something, and so he said he actually used a stick of dynamite to get a bolt off a heavy piece of machinery. So yeah, pretty crazy for sure. And so he collected that. Yeah, he got the 25 sticks of dynamite, got everything packaged, and actually a Christmas present, because she was going, on November 1st. And so I think she was going to see her daughter, which was his half sister, in Alaska. And so she was going to go for at least a couple months, I think. And so she was packing up her stuff down in the basement. And while she's doing other things, he went down there and took out her robe and some things, and then placed the bomb in her bag. She had, a huge, oversized bag, basically. And so his wife at this time actually saw him with the package, the Christmas gift, which is kind of important later. And so he was going to drive her to the airport, basically. And they dropped off, she left her car at like a hotel, and then he had dropped her off at the front gate, and then he carried the bag in. It was heavy. It was about 37 pounds. And actually, when they got up to the counter, you know, they said it was overweight, and she's going to have to pay $27, which you can imagine back then compared to today, it's probably a couple $100. And she was thinking of taking stuff out to mail it to Alaska instead. And Jack said, you know, no, you're going to need everything. You don't want to get anything lost in the mail. Let's make sure we get it on. And so obviously it already started that timer before he got out of the car for an hour. And of course she's waiting probably, you know, a half hour for the flight to take off. And then there was actually a delay, because the president at the time was Eisenhower. One of his like aides or staff of, I don't know, Secretary of Education or something, was coming from DC, and he had the connecting flight, and he's 20 minutes late. And since he was high profile, they waited an extra 20 minutes for him. And so now if they weren't waiting for that guy, that plane probably would have been up over the mountains, you know, and they would have maybe never been able to figure out like what had happened. But it was actually good that that guy got delayed. I mean, of course, sad that, you know, him and everyone else died, but it helped the recovery, because it obviously, the plane took off, and only 11 minutes after it had taken off, it blew up over the sky just east of Longmont, which I mentioned is only about a 40-minute drive north of Denver, in sugar beet fields. Sugar beets were actually one of the big crops in Colorado. You think of getting sugar from sugarcane and from tropical areas, but sugar beets were the thing back in the day, and one of the big crops of Colorado at that time. And kind of random how security was so lax in that time. Of course, they didn't have x-ray machines and all the security checks. You could actually bring ammunition on the plane. So she was actually going up to Alaska to also do caribou hunting. So she did have several pounds of, you know, like shotgun shells and different things. And after he had dropped off his mom, you know, they went up to eat dinner and watch the plane take off. And he was joking how, like, wouldn't it be crazy if, like, the ammunition went off and all the people on the plane were, like, jumping from seat to seat to avoid the bullets from hitting them. And then I think by the time they finished eating, he had heard something about a plane crashing or something unusual. And he actually went into the bathroom and threw up, you know, probably from not necessarily feeling bad, because he later said to the FBI that, you know, I saw her leave for the last time, and that was like the happiest day of my life. Like, he was just so happy that she was dead. But obviously an unusual feeling, because he did such a atrocious act. And so he drove home, and he was, out of all the passengers on the plane, he was the first one to call United Airlines and asked about like the status. They're like, oh yeah, the plane crashed, we're, you know, sorry, like everyone is presumed dead. So I assumed after he dropped his mom off in the luggage, either when he left or at some point around them, he went up to the kiosk where you could actually buy life insurance right at the airport. Like they had, which makes sense, because I know today it seems like, oh, that's weird. You could just go up and buy it like in a vending machine. But at this time, this was really new to have commercial flights. It started around, I don't know, 20s, 30s, and 40s, they had some flights, but it was kind of for like the super rich. And so also at this time, there was a lot of plane accidents at the beginning. Like I just mentioned, there was that flight only about, 3 weeks before he detonated the plane, there was one that crashed in Wyoming. And the thing is, like today they have like really good computers to help you whether, to get to point A to point B to point C, for the weather, for the pressure, for the altitude, and all these things. And so like back in the day, you had to like physically see everything. Like you needed to know what points you were going along the way to know where to go. They didn't have any national like weather service and things with good information on weather. So there was a lot of accidents. I mean, like I'd say in quite a few years, you could look up like airline disasters in America. There was like a few a year. So it was definitely pretty dangerous, which is why they, you could get life insurance at the airport basically. And so he took out like 3 policies. One was for his half-sister and for his kids, or maybe 2 of the policies were for that, and then one real big payout for just him. And actually, technically, that should have been void because his mom was supposed to also sign that. It's not just like a stranger should be able to sign off on that. But in the end, his wife did get some of the money after he was executed. I don't know exactly all the policy documents and things, but she did get some of the payout for something anyway. So the first thing people naturally would assume is that either there could be pilot error or a mechanical problem or something like that, but it was very suspicious because people saw 2 huge balls of fire in the sky falling, so they knew it exploded in the sky. You know, like I said, about 25 miles north of Denver. 2 farmers had actually come out. They were real young at the time, they're kids, and you'd even see their story, and like, yeah, like they just came out. There was like, you know, an airplane seat chair like on top of a car with like a body in it, and yeah, there were just bodies strewn all over the place. Actually horrific scene. And so they knew something seemed kind of odd for it to blow up in the air like that. So this flight, I think it left from New York, then DC, and was going to Portland and then Washington. And so there was different people getting on the flight, and there wasn't much luggage in the D compartment, which was for Denver, you know, maybe like 5 bags. And they eventually found that one of the bags, you know, was blown up basically. And they could, even the people could smell around the area that like it smelled of dynamite. And so they knew that there was something wrong at this point. They started questioning everyone, and of course looking at life insurance policies. And they even found, when they found Daisy King, his mother, around her body, she had clippings from the newspaper of like accomplishments and articles from like her family. You know, maybe like when her daughter, I don't know, won a sports game or whatever, just like achievements of her family members. And of course, for Jack Graham, there wasn't very many, right? There was like his arrests and things. So that also didn't help his case because they started asking around, and a couple of people started pointing the finger towards his direction. And so of course they started interviewing him and his wife. And there was a problem, there was a discrepancy in a story. She mentioned how she had seen him with a Christmas present. She was told that it was like kind of something where he could make jewelry. I guess his mom liked to make jewelry, so there's this big kind of heavy machinery where you could like, I don't know, clip things or like something to make jewelry anyway. And of course he said that it wasn't a package. There was nothing, he didn't mention anything about that. And so that was a big red flag. And so they continued to push him, and he, you know, calmly was saying, oh, I have nothing to do with it. I don't know what happened. Maybe, you know, he probably mentioned like maybe it was the ammunition accidentally went off or something. So, you know, there was mounting pressure, and they're looking at all his other stories and robberies and insurance claims, you know, of his car and the restaurant. And so they first got him to eventually admit he was guilty of that, the insurance fraud. And then later on, he finally, after the mounting evidence, he finally admitted to detonating the plane. And to me, it's kind of funny how like people initially will admit to crimes because it's like the first time they've been interviewed and they were just like in their house that morning. And so the distance of being home isn't that far away. But later on, then people claim innocent because they've been in jail for a few months. And so no surprise, a few months later, he tried to plead the insanity plea. He went to 4 psychiatrists. They said he was legally sane. So yeah, went to trial. And yeah, they found him guilty. And actually, it's really interesting because this had never happened before. So there was no federal crime against blowing up an airplane at that time because it had never happened before. A lot of laws are only made after something bad happens. So like even like, you know, I think like marijuana, cocaine, mushrooms, and a lot of drugs were actually legal in like the 1800s or 1900s until like they got abused, and then they made laws later. So this was the case with this situation. Afterwards, Eisenhower made a law like, you know, if you blow up a federal aircraft, you know, would be like, you know, a federal crime. And so they actually, and they didn't charge him with all of the deaths on the plane. They charged him with 1 count of first-degree murder for his mother, Daisy King. And so they got him for that, and he was sentenced to death. And so just about 15 months after the plane detonated, he was sentenced to the gas chamber. And ironically, his lawyers had tried to make a stay for the execution and tried appealing the case, even though he said, just let it go. He didn't want to appeal. He didn't want to stay. He just, you know, accepted his guilt at that point. And so it's kind of funny that they were doing that without his wishes. So just a few things that Jack said before he was executed about the case. Just despicable. The number of people to be killed made no difference to me. It could have been 1,000. When their time comes, there is nothing they can do about it. And then he later said, as far as feeling remorse for those people, I don't. I can't help it. Everybody pays their way and takes their chances. That's just the way it goes. And I think even when he called the airlines to see if like the plane had gone down that same day it blew up, he said, well, that's the way it goes on the phone. So just absolutely despicable. Like, sure, every time you walk outside, you take a chance, right? You can get hit by a bus, or, you know, you have one in, I don't know, 10,000 chances of like your plane crashing or a car accident or whatever. But like, it's a little different when someone puts dynamite inside. So I guess this is his way of just being like, well, just shit happens. It's like, no, like shit definitely happens when you put 25 sticks of dynamite. His half-sister and other people mentioned he was abusive to his wife and other people. Just huge outbursts, fighting with his mom all the time, and just a deplorable piece of shit. So anyway, I'll go over now to the school, the orphanage, where he grew up for at least 6 years or so, which is a lot of people say, well, he was in this orphanage and this is why he did the, you know, this bombing, because he was pissed at his mom and it was just so horrible. And then I'll go to the graves and then finish with all of the photos of the people's graves and their stories. So I'm here at which was a Clayton School for Boys. This was initially made for orphans of, you know, their father had passed away and their mom wouldn't be able to financially take care of them. So this guy, I think it was William Clayton, I could be wrong, but he came here in like 1859 and his wife died and so did his kid later. But yeah, he made a bunch of money over the next 30 years in Denver, and he gave like, maybe not all of his money, but a substantial amount to build this huge campus, which wasn't finished by the time he died. It was actually in like maybe 1911 they finished it. So it's like this huge campus. And the reason why this is important is because they said that, you know, Jack Gilbert Graham, one of the main reasons besides insurance money, was that his mom left him here, right? His mom had married that guy, King, and who was a rancher, had a bunch of money. And so why didn't she take him in from this orphanage? And, you know, it's a good question, but as you think about it, you know, this might have been actually a pretty good school and a place for him to be. You know, her third husband had died. She had that money and, you know, she started some businesses. Obviously, that takes a lot of time. So when I look at something like this, there's always the nature versus nurture. And maybe by him being here at this school, it made him be like a thief later and a criminal. Like, I mean, there's certainly that argument, but I also think there's always a possibility that you're just a bad seed, right? And by the way, he did go home on vacations with his mom and the stepdad, at least, well, he was only alive, I think, for a couple years that she was married to him. But so he was home on vacations for sure. So that's, you know, 2 or 3 months in the summer during, you know, Christmas and spring break. So he wasn't stuck at the orphanage all the time. Now, that's still a lot of time in between holidays. I'm not sure how many weekends she came to get him or whatever. But, you know, maybe on some of those times when he was on the ranch, you know, with his stepdad and his mom, he was doing shady shit as a kid. You know, because I don't have much information on that because, you know, most of the family doesn't want to talk about things. Of course, his mom was killed. You know, his real dad died. I guess his, you know, maybe you get some information from like his half-sister or something, but as far as I know, most people don't want to talk about it. So he might have been at that house with his stepdad and his mom, you know, like in his like teens or whatever, or as a young kid, and like maybe shit turned up missing. You know, maybe the old man's like, oh shit, like what happened to my like little statue I had from Italy or so, you know, it's like, oh, it's gone. So it's like, I bet you he was, you know, maybe just a really difficult kid. And, you know, getting into a place like this wasn't easy, I imagine, because from what I see on the website, it says from like 1911 until like the late 50s, they had 600 people come through this facility. Well, as I said in the last video, like do the numbers. And so it's like, that means that every decade there's probably only 100 students or so, which means every year that's like 10 or 12 students. So, I mean, this wasn't a place where, like, they just crammed in hundreds of people into this little house and, like, they weren't fed and it was a crappy facility. Like, this is, like, a huge, nice campus. And so, like, do I know what happened in between these walls? Was there some weird pervert, or did they beat the crap out of the kids? I don't know. You know, but even your stepdad could have did that shit, especially back in the day. You know, today that's a little rarer. So I'm not getting the impression that, like, being out here was the worst thing in the world. Now, as I said, it was probably hard to get him into a facility like this if it must have been highly selective, because it was more than 600 orphans over a 5 or 6 decade period in Colorado. So when you get people into special schools, if you unenroll them, and, you know, maybe he could have gotten into a school near where they lived, but maybe that's a shitty school district. And so maybe this was actually like a golden ticket for a few years. He would get great education, learn farming and agriculture, and then you'd be able to, you know, have some good skills when you get out. But yeah, I don't know if to say that, like, oh, this horrible orphanage, she didn't take him from here, and this was just the worst place in the world. I don't know about that. You know, it's the same situation with the last video which is why it's important for me to go to some of these locations, or at least do a little research, because, you know, even looking at Dylan's home from Columbine, you know, it doesn't excuse or doesn't tell you all the parts of the story, but it definitely shows that, like, it's not the story of, like, the poorest kid in the world, you know? It's like Dylan had that really nice home out, you know, with red rocks behind there, and this kid was in an orphanage for 6 years, still got to see his mom on holidays and probably some weekends. Today it's used as, like, early education. I don't know all the details, but it's basically, like, kind of more of like a special elementary school. But the amount of staff to run a place like this, there must have been, like, you know, 10 staff for every kid. I mean, it just doesn't seem like the worst place in the world. If you do have any information about this place from back in the day, you know, this Clayton School for Boys, if there was some horror stories or something like that, let me know. But I personally haven't heard anything. And so he didn't even graduate from here. Later on, he did take some courses at the Denver University here, and he didn't finish, like, the high school requirements there that he could have gotten, probably something like a GED, but he did meet his wife there and had 2 kids. He actually had a son and a daughter, and they were about 2 or 3 when he was executed. He was executed on January 11th, 1957, just before his 25th birthday. And so, yeah, that trial was one of the first trials that was televised in Colorado. So I'll cruise over now to the Fairmont Cemetery where Jack's mom, Daisy's, buried. Unbelievable, though. They have like 10 buildings here. I mean, I'm not sure what else they had going on besides, like, the orphanage and an education center. Maybe they had, like, a regular school, I'm guessing, but anyway. Yeah, crazy. Yes, this is where his mom's buried, and the reason why, you know, 44 people had to go. And yeah, what a deplorable kid. I don't look at her as a, you know, some evil woman that left him in this horrible orphanage. She had just gone through the 30s, you know, that was her, you know, 3rd husband, and 2 of them had died, and she probably knew real tough times, and she wanted to invest that money in some businesses and things that could work out, because at that time they were like, yeah, you never know when there's going to be another Great Depression or when you're broke. he was probably a pain in the ass as a little kid. And her and none of those other 43 people on that plane deserve that. And to me, he was just an entitled little brat. You know, he had just had 2 kids. He just didn't want to work. I mean, these are all insurance scams, right? The car, the restaurant, you know, the plane. It's just, he had 2 kids. He knew he was going to have to work the rest of his life, and he didn't want to do that. And that's why I see a lot of these crimes and things. Just people obviously don't want to get a regular job. He could have had that restaurant he was running. And yeah, he tried to take out that insurance policy for, which in today's term would have been, you know, couple $100,000, and she had at least, you know, in today's terms, which would have been about $1 million or something. So yeah, just trying to collect that paycheck. So that orphanage story, sorry, I don't, 5-6 years in that orphanage, that place is well staffed, a lot of money. That guy left a lot of money to make that place a good facility for boys. And I think possibly his ashes were laid here. I hope not. I hope they flush that down at the toilet at the prison. But that plane, when it took off, it was 11 minutes until it blew up. And he was in the gas chamber for 11 minutes, yapping and yelling and until he succumbed. So, but that was too good. You know, the amount of people's lives. I mean, they were from 13 months to 82 years old. You know, just, I wish I could tell all the stories, but there's so many. And it's not even the stories of the other 43 people that died, but all of their loved ones. I mean, you're looking at hundreds of people's lives ruined. And sorry, but in some cases, I'm all about medieval torture. You know, I wish there was like, oh, we'll give you the gas chamber, but you got to do 43 years first, like 1 year with each of these families. And like, you're going to live in their basement in a cell, and they can do whatever they want to you for a year. So I know that would never happen, and it's kind of crazy, but yeah, some people just get off too easy. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe. I'll end this video with some of the information on all the other 43 people that died, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.